The clean tang of floral disinfectant and cold sweat always trailed behind Jane, but this morning a completely different phantom walked beside her. A lie. She truly believed her faded, loose-fitting cotton uniform and perpetually bowed head would render her invisible beneath the towering, blood-stained arches of the Muñoz estate. She assumed that handing a thick envelope of unmarked bills to a secluded Miami physician would permanently bury the trail of the life developing within her soft, heavy frame. But you cannot conceal a spark from the monster who commands the night. Alberto Muñoz hadn't simply discovered that his quiet, plus-sized housekeeper was carrying his child. He had already extorted the medical records from her doctor before she had even stepped back onto the pavement outside the clinic. The dizziness slammed into Jane the exact second her sensible shoes crossed the threshold of the mansion's cavernous marble foyer. She choked back a gasp, pressing a trembling palm against her lips, her skin turning completely bloodless. The grand obsidian columns of the estate seemed to spin violently around her voluptuous figure. Jane. The memory of 9 weeks ago hit her with the same brutal force as the morning sickness, instantly drowning out the grand, echoing quiet of the foyer. It had been a Tuesday night, the kind of heavy, humid Miami evening where the air felt like a damp velvet shroud. Jane had been deep in the East Wing, putting away the fresh linens, when the peaceful silence of the Muñoz estate was violently shattered. The sound wasn't the distant rumble of thunder, it was the deafening, sharp crack of automatic gunfire tearing through the glass conservatory downstairs. Screams had echoed, followed by the heavy, hurried thud of tactical boots on marble. Terrified, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, Jane had dropped the sheets and pressed herself against the shadow of a corridor pillar. She was a nobody, a girl hired to dust the crown moldings and keep the blood off the floors, not survive the wars that spilled it. But then, the heavy mahogany double doors at the end of the hall had burst open. Alberto had stumbled in. The formidable, untouchable Don was barely holding himself upright. His black dress shirt was torn open, soaked through with a deep, terrifying crimson that spilled from a jagged tear in his side. His breathing was a harsh, ragged growl, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles bunched under his heavily tattooed neck. He had his custom firearm drawn, but his grip was slipping, his vision clearly dark at the edges. When his pitch-black eyes had lifted and locked onto Jane, she saw the apex predator, realizing he was cornered. Any other staff member would have run, saving their own skin. But looking at the blood pouring through his fingers, something primal had overridden Jane's chronic timidity. Moving faster than her heavy frame usually allowed, she had rushed to his side. She caught his massive, muscular bulk just as his knees began to give way, wrapping her arms around his waist and bearing the crushing weight of his frame. "This way," she had whispered, her voice trembling but resolute. She guided him into a concealed, reinforced safe room, hidden behind a floor-to-ceiling tapestry. A room only the senior staff knew existed. Once the heavy steel door clicked shut, sealing out the chaotic gunfire outside, the silence had become absolute. Alberto collapsed against the plush velvet chaise lounge, his head falling back as a harsh groan escaped his lips. Jane didn't hesitate. She dropped to her knees before him, her hands flying to his ruined shirt. With trembling fingers, she ripped away the expensive silk to expose the wound. It was a deep graze, bleeding profusely but missing the vital organs. Ripping clean strips from her cotton apron, she set to work, applying firm, steady pressure. "You should be running, Jane," Alberto had rasped out, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that sent an unexpected shiver straight down her spine. He watched her through heavy lids, his dark eyes tracking the intense focus on her face, the way her curly hair had tumbled loose from its bun, and the frantic rise and fall of her heavy chest. "I'm patching you up, Mr. Muñoz. Keep still," she had murmured, her naturally soft voice acting like an anchor in the dark room. As her hands worked over his skin, pressing the makeshift bandages against his torn flesh, the sheer adrenaline of the attack began to mutate into something entirely different, something thick and suffocatingly hot. Alberto's breathing hitched, not from the pain, but from the sudden, intense proximity. His large, heavily ringed hand suddenly shot out, wrapping around her plump wrist, stopping her movements. Jane looked up, her hazel eyes wide with sudden alarm. But there was no violence in his gaze. It burned with a feral, possessive heat. "You're shaking," he murmured, his thumb brushing against the soft skin of her inner wrist. I'm scared," she confessed honestly, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Don't be," Alberto had growled softly, pulling her closer until her plush thighs were pressed firmly against his uninjured side. The danger outside faded into non-existence. Alberto didn't look through her as he usually did during his cold walks through the estate. He looked at her. His rough, calloused hand left her wrist and moved to her jawline, lifting her face, his gaze dragging hungrily over her flushed cheeks and full lips. When he kissed her, it was a sudden, devastating collision of hunger and relief. Jane gasped into his mouth, and that was all the invitation he needed. The ruthless Mafia Don, a man surrounded by sharp angles and calculating ambition, had completely unraveled in her soft embrace. He didn't want a model. He wanted her abundance. His large, heavily tattooed hands mapped every inch of her plus-sized figure, gripping the fullness of her hips and the soft curve of her waist with a desperate, worshipful strength. He praised the plushness of her body, treating her skin like a sacred text he had been dying to read. For the first time in her life, Jane didn't feel the need to hide her weight. Under his touch, her softness felt like an absolute power. But as the tropical Miami sun began to bleed through the high, reinforced transoms of the safe room, the intoxicating spell shattered. The gunfire had long ceased. Reality rushed back in with the morning light. Looking at the sleeping Don beside her, his possessive arms still draped heavy over her waist, terror seized her. She was just the housekeeper. He was a man who ordered executions with a flick of his wrist. Fearing she would wake up to find his cold, professional demeanor returned. Fearing she would be discarded as a temporary lapse in judgment or exposed to his enemies, Jane had quietly untangled herself from his grip. She gathered her ruined apron, adjusted her uniform, and fled back to the safety of the staff quarters in the dim light of dawn, praying the shadows would swallow her secret whole. The rhythmic, scraping sound of the silver polish against an antique cream pitcher did nothing to soothe the frantic fluttering in Jane's chest. Back in the present, the opulence of the Muñoz estate felt less like a workplace and more like an arena. She stood at the long, dark mahogany sideboard in the formal dining room, her knuckles straining white against the cloth as she desperately tried to control her breathing. The heavy, metallic scent of the silver cream, mixed with the faint morning aroma of the espresso machine down the hall, suddenly hit the back of her throat like a wave of pure lead. She swallowed hard, her jaw tightening as she forced the wave of morning sickness back down. "Keep moving," she told herself, her eyes darting nervously to the grand arched doorway. "If you stop, you look weak. If you look weak, he looks closer." She had intentionally pulled on her thickest, most oversized winter uniform sweater over her standard dress, a heavy, formless wool that completely swallowed the lush curves Alberto had spent a night worshipping 9 weeks ago. It was stiflingly hot for a humid Miami morning, the sweat already prickling at the nape of her neck beneath her pinned-up curls, but the fabric served as a shield, a barrier to hide the slight, unmistakable softening of her lower stomach. A heavy, deliberate footstep echoed on the marble tile outside the room. Jane's posture instantly went rigid. She dipped her cloth back into the polishing paste, keeping her head low, her gaze fixed entirely on the reflective surface of a silver teapot. But even without looking up, she felt the temperature in the room shift. The air grew thick, charged with a suffocating, possessive gravity that could only belong to one person. Alberto Muñoz stepped into the dining room. He had discarded his suit jacket, wearing only a bespoke black silk dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, exposing the intricate, dark ink of the syndicate tattoos crawling up his muscular wrists. He didn't say a word. He simply leaned his towering frame against the edge of the heavy oak doorframe, crossing his arms over his broad chest. Jane kept polishing, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She could see his reflection in the silver teapot. His pitch-black eyes weren't just looking at her. They were tracking the slight tremor in her fingers, the pale sheen of sweat on her forehead, and the unnatural stiffness of her shoulders. It was the gaze of an apex predator watching a wounded creature try to pretend it wasn't bleeding. "You missed breakfast preparation in the main kitchen this morning, Jane," Alberto said, his deep, gravelly voice cutting through the silence of the room like a velvet blade. Jane cleared her throat quickly, forcing her voice into its usual quiet, apologetic register. "My apologies, Mr. Muñoz. I had a headache. I asked Maria to cover the morning prep for me." "Did you?" Alberto murmured, straightening up and taking a slow, measured step into the room. The sheer mass of him seemed to pull the oxygen out of the space. He walked to the opposite side of the sideboard, his dark eyes never leaving her face. "Because Maria mentioned you nearly fainted when she brought the garlic-heavy mojo sauce out of the pantry. She said you ran out of the room clutching your mouth." Jane's breath hitched. She kept her eyes glued to the silver, scrubbed harder. "I think the garlic was just a bit spoiled. Sir, my stomach has been sensitive lately." "Sensitive?" Alberto repeated, the word rolling off his tongue with a dangerous, assessing slow pace. He closed the distance between them until he was standing a mere foot away, separated only by the narrow width of the sideboard. He leaned down slightly, bringing his face into her line of sight. "And the sweater, Jane? It is 85 degrees outside, yet you are wearing wool thick enough to survive a New York winter. Are you freezing in my house?" "I'm just catching a cold, sir," she blurted out, the lie tasting like ash. She instinctively stepped back, her heavy thighs brushing against the dining chairs behind her, her hand moving automatically, defensively, to hover just over her abdomen. A flash of dark, possessive anger crossed Alberto's features so quickly she almost missed it, replaced instantly by a cold, terrifying certainty. He reached across the table, his large, calloused fingers gently but firmly catching her chin, forcing her hazel eyes up to meet his burning, territorial gaze. "You are a terrible liar, mi reina," he whispered, his thumb pressing into the soft skin of her jaw. "I don't like being kept in the dark, especially not by the woman who saved my life." Jane trembled under his touch, utterly terrified that if she breathed too hard, he would hear the second heartbeat hiding beneath the wool. The humid Miami air outside the estate gates offered a fleeting illusion of freedom, but Jane's chest remained tight as she stepped onto the city bus. It was her calculated day off, a precious window of time she had spent days planning. She sat near the back, her gaze fixed out the window, ensuring her formless sweater was pulled tightly over her lap. To avoid leaving a digital trail that Alberto's extensive network could flag, she had left her credit cards behind, relying entirely on a thick stack of unmarked cash tucked into the deepest pocket of her canvas tote bag. She switched buses twice, intentionally weaving through the crowded transit lines of the city to shake off any casual eyes. Her destination was a highly discreet, ultra-exclusive maternity clinic, tucked away in a quiet, affluent neighborhood, a place known for its absolute privacy and high-profile clientele. When the glass doors of the clinic finally slid shut behind her, cutting off the sweltering heat, Jane let out a long, shaky breath. She approached the receptionist, speaking in a hushed whisper as she handed over the cash for an out-of-pocket, off-the-books consultation. For a brief moment, sitting in the plush cream armchair of the waiting room, she genuinely believed she had successfully slipped into the shadows. She was entirely wrong. Across the sun-drenched avenue, parked perfectly parallel to a row of luxury vehicles, a sleek black SUV sat with its engine purring silently. Inside, Alberto's lead enforcer kept his eyes locked on the clinic's entrance, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the steering wheel. He adjusted his earpiece, dialing a direct line. "Boss," the enforcer muttered, his voice low and devoid of emotion. "She just walked in. It's the maternity clinic on the north side, Dr. Vance's private practice." On the other end of the line, the silence that followed was heavy and absolute, vibrating with a cold, terrifying gravity. "Secure the perimeter," Alberto's gravelly voice finally commanded, sounding like tectonic plates shifting. "Get me the doctor's direct office line. Now." 10 minutes later, inside the clinic's private inner office, Dr. Vance was reviewing a freshly printed chart when his personal, unlisted desk phone began to ring. Frowning, the veteran physician picked up the receiver. "Dr. Vance speaking." "Doctor." A smooth, dark velvet voice purred through the line. The physician's blood ran instantly cold. In the Miami underworld, that voice was an urban legend, a symbol of absolute authority and lethal finality. "Mr. Muñoz," Dr. Vance stammered, his hand trembling as he instinctively reached to pull the window blinds shut. "To what do I owe this honor? I assure you, all accounts regarding your family's associates are perfectly up to date." "They are," Alberto replied, his tone chillingly calm, yet laced with a subterranean rage. "But a woman just walked into your clinic. She is wearing an oversized uniform sweater. Her hair is tied up, and she is terrified. Her name is Jane Norris." Dr. Vance swallowed hard, glancing toward the door that led to the examination rooms. "Mr. Muñoz, you know my practice relies on absolute patient confidentiality. Medical ethics." "Save the ethics lecture for the coroner, Vance," Alberto interrupted, his voice dropping an octave into a lethal whisper that seemed to vibrate through the plastic of the receiver. "That woman belongs to me. She is carrying my blood. I already know why she is there, and I want you to confirm the exact timeline. If you lie to me, or if you attempt to shield her secret, I will not only dismantle your medical license by morning, I will have my enforcers burn this beautiful little clinic to the ground, with you trapped inside it." A heavy drop of sweat rolled down the doctor's temple. He had spent a lifetime building a reputation for discretion, but you do not negotiate with the devil incarnate. Survival overrode every oath he had ever taken. She is 9 weeks pregnant, Mr. Muñoz," Dr. Vance whispered, his voice cracking under the psychological weight of the threat. "The ultrasound shows a healthy, developing fetus. The heartbeat is exceptionally strong." A long, heavy exhale echoed through the phone, sounding less like anger and more like a possessive, territorial relief. "Print her a copy of the sonogram," Alberto ordered, his tone shifting back to an absolute command. "Give her whatever prenatal vitamins she requires. Do not tell her we spoke, and do not let her leave that building feeling unsafe. I will handle her myself when she returns. And Vance?" "Yes, sir. If she ever misses an appointment, or if your staff treats her with anything less than absolute reverence, I will personally ensure you never draw breath again. Am I understood?" "Crystal clear, Mr. Muñoz." The line went dead. 10 minutes later, Jane emerged from the back room, clutching a small paper bag of vitamins and a hidden black and white sonogram photo in her purse, completely unaware that the very ground beneath her feet had already been claimed by the dawn. The heavy oak doors of the Muñoz estate clicked shut behind Jane, sealing her back inside the silent, suffocating grandeur of Alberto's world. She let out a long, trembling breath, her hand instinctively pressing against the canvas tote bag resting against her hip. Inside, hidden beneath her spare uniform, was the paper bag from the clinic. She truly believed she had pulled it off. The buses had been crowded, the cash untraceable, and the doctor's office entirely private. Stepping deeper into the cavernous marble foyer, she began to slip off her heavy outer jacket, preparing to disappear back into the quiet routine of the staff quarters. "You're back early, Jane." The dark, gravelly voice echoed from the shadows near the grand, sweeping staircase. Jane froze, her heart instantly leaping into her throat. Alberto stepped into the light of the massive chandelier. He was still wearing the black silk shirt with the sleeves rolled up, the intricate syndicate ink on his forearms catching the light. His expression wasn't angry. It was entirely devoid of emotion, a terrifying mask of absolute certainty. In his left hand, he held a plain manila envelope. "Mr. Muñoz," Jane squeaked out, her voice betraying her panic. She instinctively stepped backward, her sensible shoes clicking sharply against the marble. I just finished my errands. I was about to start on the dinner preparations." "Dinner can wait," Alberto murmured, his slow, deliberate footsteps closing the distance between them. The sheer gravity of his presence seemed to compress the air in the foyer, making it impossible to breathe. Jane backed up until her shoulders hit the cold stone of an obsidian pillar. She was trapped. She watched in sheer terror as Alberto stopped mere inches from her, his massive frame completely blocking out the rest of the room. The scent of him, sandalwood, expensive tobacco, and raw, concentrated power, overwhelmed her senses. Without a word, he raised the manila envelope, flicking his wrist to slide the contents out. It was a crisp, black-and-white sonogram print. The image of a 9-week-old fetus, healthy and undeniable. Jane's breath hitched completely. A gasp ripped from her throat, her hands flying to her mouth as hot tears instantly welling in her eyes. How did you? I told you before, mi reina. You are a terrible liar, Alberto interrupted softly, his voice dropping into a commanding velvet purr. He reached out, his large, heavily tattooed hand firmly but gently catching her chin, tilting her face up so she had no choice but to look into his pitch-black, fiercely possessive eyes. Did you really think you could walk through my city, carrying my bloodline, and hide it from me? Please, Jane sobbed, the dam finally breaking. She shrank into herself, her plump shoulders shaking as she tried to make her large body look as small as possible beneath his gaze. Please, Alberto. I didn't want to trap you. I know what I am. I'm just your housekeeper. I'm fat, I'm soft, and I don't belong in your world. I was going to leave. I was going to buy a ticket to the Midwest and never bother you again. I swear. Silence, Alberto growled, the low, feral sound vibrating against her skin. His grip on her chin tightened just enough to stop her words, his thumb sweeping roughly over her trembling lips. His dark eyes blazed with an unhinged, territorial devotion. Never say those words to me again, he whispered fiercely, his face inches from hers. You think I care about the dynamic of this house? You think you are just a servant to me? I tasted you, Jane. I mapped every inch of your perfect, abundant body in that safe room, and I haven't slept a full night since you ran from my bed. He dropped the envelope, his massive hands moving down to grip her wide, soft waist with a desperate, crushing strength, forcing her plush frame flush against his hard, muscular chest. His thumbs pressed deep into the softness of her stomach, through the thick wool of her sweater. You are not leaving this estate. You are not going to the Midwest, Alberto confessed, his voice thick with a dark, lethal vow. I bought Dr. Vance's entire practice while you were sitting in his waiting room. I own the block you walked on. I own the air you breathe. This child is the heir to the Muñoz syndicate, and your body is my absolute sanctuary. From this second on, you belong to me, Jane. You aren't a housekeeper anymore. You are mine. The transition from servant quarters to the inner sanctum of the Muñoz empire was instantaneous and absolute. By nightfall, Alberto had completely banned Jane from lifting a finger in the estate. He had already broken her old apartment lease in the city, erasing the last paper trail of her independent life within an hour. Her plain, faded maid uniforms were summarily confiscated and destroyed, replaced entirely by an environment designed to cage and cherish her. He moved her into his deeply fortified master penthouse wing, a steel-reinforced sanctuary accessible only by a private, biometric elevator. When the double doors of the massive walk-in closet slid open, Jane gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. The space was larger than her entire previous apartment, but it wasn't filled with the sharp, sample-sized designer clothes meant for runway models. Instead, rows of custom-tailored, high-end size 18 silk-wrapped dresses, heavy cashmere loungewear, and emerald maternity pieces hung from velvet hangers. Alberto had ordered his personal shoppers to clear out the city's boutiques, demanding fabrics that would explicitly flatter and yield to her generous proportions. I can't wear this, Alberto, Jane whispered, her voice trembling as she ran her fingers over a rich, deep burgundy silk gown. I don't know how to be the kind of woman who wears these things. I'm soft. I'm clumsy. I look ridiculous. Alberto closed the distance between them, his towering frame radiating a dark, suffocating heat. He didn't answer her with words at first. Instead, he gripped her wide, plush hips, guiding her backward until the backs of her knees hit the velvet ottoman in the center of the closet, forcing her to sit. Then, the formidable Mafia Don, a ruthless tyrant who bowed to no law and no man, dropped to his knees on the floor before her. Jane's breath caught in her throat as he knelt at her feet. His large, heavily calloused hands gently pushed the fabric of her new silk loungewear up her calves. his tattooed fingers tracing the heavy, soft curve of her legs with a slow, deliberate reverence. He leaned forward, burying his face against the plush mound of her stomach, his hot breath soaking through the silk, right over her 9-week bump. "Do not insult what is mine, Jane," Alberto growled softly, his voice a low, gravelly vibration against her skin. He lifted his head, his pitch-black eyes burning with a feral, unyielding devotion that made her knees weak. "I spend my days surrounded by sharp, starving, ruthless killers. My world is nothing but concrete, blood, and betrayal. You think I want a woman made of sharp angles and calculating ambition?" He pressed his large, ringed hands firmly into the soft flesh of her waist, anchoring her to him. "I want soft," Alberto declared fiercely, his voice dropping into a possessive velvet purr. "I want lush. You are a Renaissance painting in a room full of cheap glass. Jane, your abundance is the only mercy I have left in this life. You are my only sanctuary, and I am going to spend the next 7 months worshiping the body that is growing my son." Jane felt a hot tear slip down her cheek, her fingers instinctively tangling into his dark, styled hair. For her entire life, her size had been a source of crushing shame, a reason to hide in the shadows. To the most dangerous man in Miami, it had just become a religion. The underground corridors of the Miami syndicates had been buzzing for 3 weeks with venomous whispers. To the rival families, the rumors that the ruthless Alberto Muñoz had locked away and married his plus-sized housekeeper weren't a romance. They were a glaring signal of structural decay. A Don who chose a civilian servant over a strategic cartel bloodline was a Don gone soft. Alberto knew exactly what the vipers were whispering, and tonight he was going to crush their confidence. "Stand still, mi reina," Alberto murmured, his gravelly voice dropping over Jane's bare shoulders like heavy velvet. She stood before the full-length mirror in the penthouse suite, her hands trembling so violently she could barely keep them rested against the tiny, 12-week swell of her stomach. The plain cotton aprons of her past were entirely gone. Tonight, Alberto had dressed her for a battlefield. She wore a custom-made, heavy emerald silk wrap dress that gripped every abundant curve of her size 18 frame, the fabric plunging daringly at her heavy breasts and cinching tightly at her waist. A collar of raw, flawless diamonds rested heavily against her collarbone, catching the light like shards of ice. Her dark curly hair had been pinned up in cascading, voluminous waves. She looked expensive. She looked like a sovereign. But inside, she felt like a fraud, trapped in a display case. "Alberto, please," she whispered, her hazel eyes wide with panic as she looked at his imposing reflection behind her. He was dressed in a sharp, bespoke black suit, the collar open to expose his throat tattoos. "They are going to laugh at me. They are going to see right through this dress. I am a housekeeper. I don't know how to look these men in the eye." Alberto turned her around slowly, his large, calloused hands resting heavily on her wide hips. He leaned down, pressing his forehead against hers, his dark eyes burning with a terrifying, unyielding intensity. "They will not laugh, Jane," he growled softly, his thumb tracing the flush of her cheek. "They are wolves, but I am the monster that keeps the wolves on a leash. You hold your head high. You let them stare, but remember, every man in that room answers to the blood running through your veins tonight." The banquet was held in the vault room of a heavily fortified estate in Coral Gables, a private fortress shielded from the public and swarming with Muñoz enforcers. The air inside the dining hall was thick with the rich scent of seared wagyu, expensive wine, and the pungent cigar smoke of 20 dangerous men. When the double doors opened, the boisterous laughter and clinking glasses died instantly. 20 pairs of cold, calculating eyes snapped to the entrance. These were cartel bosses, executioners, and high-level underbosses who dealt in blood and concrete. They stared at Alberto, and then their gazes drifted to Jane. She felt the immediate weight of their judgment, the subtle sneers, the raised eyebrows. She wasn't an icy cartel princess. She was voluptuous, visibly nervous, and entirely out of her depth. Alberto didn't let her shrink away. Placing a heavy, possessive hand on the small of her back, he guided her down the length of the long mahogany table, pulling out the grand chair at the head of the banquet before taking his place right beside her. "Gentlemen," Alberto announced, his voice slicing through the dead silence of the room with a chilling, effortless authority. "My wife, Jane Muñoz." A tense, shallow murmur of congratulations rippled through the syndicate leaders, but the air remained suffocatingly tight. The target had been officially presented, and the vultures were already circling. The rich, heavy pour of Barolo wine did nothing to ease the suffocating tension humming through the vault room. Jane sat perfectly rigid, her fingers curling tightly into the silk of her emerald dress beneath the table, her eyes lowered to her plate. The silent judgment of the syndicate leaders felt like a physical weight, but it was about to find its voice. Halfway down the long banquet table, Vincent Moretti, a vicious, older cartel boss who had long sought to force his own daughter onto Alberto's throne, leaned back in his leather chair. He swirled his glass, a smug, venomous smile spreading across his weathered face. "Congratulations, Muñoz," Moretti said, his voice dripping with thinly veiled condescension as he looked directly at Jane. "Though I must confess, the entire underworld is in shock. We all expected a dawn of your caliber to choose a queen with a bit more pedigree. No offense to the new bride, but she doesn't exactly look like she was built to survive the crossfire of our world. Seems she was built for domestic comfort rather than a don't throne." The room went completely dead silent. A few underbosses subtly shifted their chairs backward, recognizing the terrifying boundary that had just been crossed. Jane's face burned with sudden, deep humiliation. She shrank back against her seat, her throat tightening as tears of shame threatened to spill. It was exactly what she had feared, that her background and her plus-sized body would make her a mockery in front of his men. Alberto didn't shout. He didn't slam his fists onto the mahogany. Instead, he calmly picked up his silver steak knife, turning the heavy blade over in his hand to admire the edge under the chandelier light. Then, with the slow, fluid grace of a Trini-apex predator, he stood up. The silence in the room grew heavy enough to suffocate as Alberto walked slowly around the perimeter of the table, his footsteps echoing like a death knell. He stopped directly behind Vincent Moretti. Moretti's smug smile faltered. A bead of cold sweat traced down his temple, his shoulders going rigid, though he desperately tried to maintain his tough exterior. "Vincent," Alberto whispered, his voice dangerously soft, slipping into a low, velvet purr that made the hair on the back of everyone's necks stand up. "You have known me a long time. You know how I manage my territory. You know that I do not tolerate structural errors, and I never make mistakes." "Just an observation, boss," Moretti stammered, his hand shaking against his wineglass. "An observation," Alberto repeated. In a blur of motion too fast for the human eye to track, Alberto's hand shot out. He grabbed a fistful of Moretti's gray hair, violently yanking his head backward, and drove the heavy steak knife straight down. The blade sliced clean through the center of Moretti's palm, pinning his hand flat to the oak table with a sickening, solid thud. Moretti let out a strangled, agonizing shriek. Several cartel members instinctively jumped to their feet, their hands darting inside their jackets. But Alberto's personal guards instantly drew their firearms, aiming directly at the dissenters. "Sit down," Alberto roared, the sound vibrating with raw, unhinged violence that seemed to shake the very walls of the vault. The men slowly sank back into their seats, their hands raised in immediate surrender. Alberto leaned down, his face a mere inch from Moretti's wide, terrified eyes. "You look at my wife and you see domestic comfort," Alberto growled, his pitch-black eyes burning with a demonic, territorial fire. "I look at my wife, and I see the only reason I don't burn this entire city to the ground. Her body is sacred to me. Her softness is the only sanctuary I possess in this life. You disrespect her. You disrespect my bloodline." He twisted the handle of the knife, pinning Moretti closer to the wood as the man groaned in agony. Alberto lifted his head, his gaze sweeping over the terrified faces of every underboss in the room. "If anyone in this syndicate," Alberto announced, his voice carrying the finality of a judge passing sentence, "ever looks at my wife with anything less than absolute reverence, If anyone ever utters another word about her size, her past, or her worth, I will not just take your life. I will systematically erase your names and your entire lineage from this earth. Is that understood? Understood, boss. A chorus of shaky, terrified voices echoed instantly. Alberto violently shoved Moretti's head forward, pulling the bloody blade free from the table. He pulled a linen napkin from his pocket, casually wiping the silver as he walked back to the head of the table. He adjusted his cuffs, his dark eyes locking onto Jane. Jane was trembling, but as she looked at this terrifying, beautiful monster who had just subjugated the most dangerous men in the city purely to protect her honor, something inside her shifted. The timid, hiding housekeeper died in that chair. In her place, a new woman took a breath, a queen who realized she wielded absolute total power over the man who ruled the underworld. Jane didn't look away. Instead, she reached out her soft, plump hand and rested it over his large, scarred knuckles on the table. "Thank you, husband," she said, her voice clear, steady, and ringing out through the silent room. A dark, triumphant smirk played on Alberto's lips. He brought her knuckles to his mouth, kissing them gently, while keeping his territorial gaze fixed on the room. "Eat, gentlemen," he commanded, taking his seat. "We have an empire to run." The sweltering July heat of Miami baked the asphalt outside the hospital windows, but inside the ultra-exclusive, private VIP maternity wing on the 11th floor, the air was crisp, cool, and smelled faintly of expensive orchids. At 34 weeks pregnant, Jane was a vision of maternal abundance. Her belly was massive, stretching the heavy fabric of a cream-colored silk maternity gown. Her thick thighs ached under the new weight, and her full breasts rested heavily against her chest. To the world, she was the ultimate target. To Alberto, she was a living deity. He had kept his promise, transforming her innate shame into a quiet, unshakable confidence over the past months. "Your vitals are absolutely perfect, Mrs. Muñoz." The newly appointed private physician smiled, adjusting the blood pressure cuff on Jane's plump arm. Alberto had essentially bought out the doctor's contract to ensure Jane had the finest medical infrastructure in the city entirely at her disposal. "He's kicking a lot today," Jane said softly, resting her manicured hand over the giant, solid curve of her stomach. Standing in the corner of the room, arms crossed over his broad chest, Alberto's hard, tattooed face softened into a look of absolute adoration. "He knows he's going to rule this city," he murmured, stepping forward to press a lingering, possessive kiss to the crown of her head. "I have to step into the hallway to take a security update from the docks, Mirena. My men are right outside the door. I will be back in 2 minutes." "Don't be long," she smiled, leaning into his touch. Alberto slipped out of the room, the heavy wooden door clicking shut behind him. The doctor turned back to his monitors to print the latest charts, humming a quiet tune, while Jane reached for her glass of ice water. Then, the world exploded. It didn't happen with a warning. It happened with the terrifying, muffled crack of suppressed automatic gunfire just outside. The heavy wooden door to the examination room splintered inward as the lifeless body of one of Alberto's guards was violently thrown into the room, crashing against a cart of medical instruments. Jane screamed, a raw sound of pure terror, as her body instinctively curled inward. She wrapped her thick arms tightly around her stomach, using her own plush frame as a shield to protect the life inside her. 3 men breached the threshold. They weren't dressed in the standard suits of the local cartels. They wore full tactical gear, their faces entirely concealed behind black balaclavas. Rogue mercenaries hired to do dirty work that couldn't be traced back to rival territory. "Grab the woman!" the lead attacker barked, advancing rapidly toward the bed. "The contract specifies she must be alive to leverage Muñoz. Eliminate the doctor." The physician didn't even have time to raise his hands before 2 suppressed rounds tore through his chest, dropping him instantly to the linoleum floor. Jane's blood ran entirely cold. The timid, hiding housekeeper she used to be would have frozen. She would have cowered and begged for mercy. But Alberto Muñoz had spent the last 6 months rewriting her DNA, teaching her that she was a queen, and a queen protects her heir at all costs. As the first mercenary lunged forward, his heavy hands reaching to drag her off the bed by her arms. Jane didn't shrink away. Driven by a sudden primal surge of maternal rage, she reached blindly behind her fingers wrapping around the edge of a heavy, solid silver medical tray, resting on the bedside table. With a guttural cry, she swung the heavy tray with all the force her large frame possessed, slamming the sharp edge directly into the mercenary's exposed temple. The solid metal cracked against his skull. The man groaned, his eyes rolling back as his legs folded beneath him, sending him crashing unconscious to the floor. The remaining two mercenaries froze in absolute shock. They had been briefed to kidnap a soft, weak, oversized civilian. They had not prepared for a lioness. That single second of hesitation was all it took. The door frame splintered completely as a shadow moved into the room so fast and with a violence so absolute it barely looked human. Alberto Muñoz entered the suite, not as a businessman or a don, but as the apex predator of the underworld. He didn't use a firearm. He used his bare hands. Alberto gripped the closest mercenary by the throat, lifting the full-grown man entirely off his feet, and drove his skull directly into the reinforced concrete pillar of the hospital wall with a sickening crunch. The final attacker tried to spin around, raising his rifle, but Alberto closed the distance instantly. He stripped the weapon from the man's grip with terrifying ease, snapped his wrist like a dry twig, and drove a fatal, crushing blow into his chest. In less than 30 seconds, the pristine VIP suite had become an absolute slaughterhouse. Alberto didn't even look at the bodies. He dropped the ruined rifle and rushed to the corner of the bed where Jane was backed up, hyperventilating, her plush body trembling violently, the bloody silver tray still gripped tightly in her white-knuckled hands. "Jane! Jane, look at me," Alberto commanded, his voice raw with a panic no one in the city had ever heard from him. He dropped heavily to his knees on the bed before her, his large hands frantically patting down her thick thighs, her massive stomach, and her chest, checking for any hidden wounds. "Are you hit? Are you bleeding, mi reina?" It's not my blood," she sobbed, finally letting the silver tray clatter to the mattress as she collapsed forward into his muscular chest. "They shot the doctor, Alberto. They tried to take the baby." Alberto crushed her generous soft frame against his heart, burying his face in the crook of her neck. He was shaking. The most ruthless tyrant in Miami was trembling like a leaf as he held her. "I have you," he growled against her skin, the sound laced with a demonic promise of retribution. "I have you, and I am going to paint the streets of this city red for touching what is mine." Suddenly, Jane gasped, her back arching violently as a sharp, agonizing contraction ripped through her abdomen. Her fingers dug like talons into Alberto's shoulders. "Alberto!" she choked out, a sudden hot gush of fluid soaking through her silk gown and onto the sheets. "My water!" "It's too early. The baby is coming right now." The next 12 hours descended into a blur of absolute, chaotic terror. While a backup trauma team flooded the ruined suite to clear the carnage, a specialized neonatal team rushed Jane down the corridor into an emergency delivery room. The entire medical complex was instantly placed on total lockdown. Over 200 of the Muñoz syndicate's most lethal soldiers surrounded the building, barricading the surrounding avenues, and turning the hospital into an impenetrable fortress. Alberto never left her side. He stripped off his blood-stained suit jacket and rolled up his sleeves, entirely indifferent to the sweat, the blood, or the screaming. He held her heavy, plush leg against his chest, murmuring frantic Spanish prayers and fierce vows of devotion against her damp forehead as she pushed through the agonizing, premature labor. Across Miami, his unbridled wrath was being executed in real time. He had made a single, cold phone call from the delivery room. 30 minutes later, Vincent Moretti was found dead in his private club, an unmistakable Muñoz signature left behind. The message was sent to every family in the underworld. Touch the queen, and your entire line dies. "One more push, Mrs. Muñoz," the lead obstetrician shouted over the frantic beeping of the monitors. "The shoulders are crowning." "I can't," Jane sobbed, her face red and swollen, her thick body utterly exhausted from the strain. "Alberto, I'm so tired." I can't do it. Look at me, Alberto commanded fiercely, gripping her cheeks with his massive, scarred hands, forcing her hazel eyes to meet his dark, burning gaze. You are the strongest thing I have ever known. You fought off a killer to protect our son. You are a Muñoz, Jane. Push for me. Give me our boy. With a primal scream that shattered the sterile quiet of the room, Jane bore down one final time. The space fell dead silent for 2 agonizing seconds, followed immediately by the piercing, beautiful wail of a newborn baby. Jane collapsed back against the pillows, sobbing uncontrollably with pure relief. He's beautiful, the doctor announced, quickly cleaning the infant. A little early, but his lungs sound incredible. A very strong baby boy. The nurse wrapped the tiny, squalling infant in a warm blanket and walked over, handing him not to Jane, but to Alberto. The ruthless, terrifying mob boss, a man who had systematically ended a rival syndicate an hour prior without blinking, stared down at the fragile bundle in his massive, tattooed arms. Real, hot tears spilled over his dark lashes, tracking down his sharp cheekbones. He dropped heavily to his knees beside Jane's hospital bed, gently resting the baby against her soft, heaving chest. Look what you made me do. Alberto wept, his voice breaking completely as he pressed his lips to Jane's damp hair. Look at our perfect boy. Jane looked down at the tiny face, a flawless blend of her softness and Alberto's sharp features. She wrapped her plump arms around her son, holding him against her heavy breasts. She was completely exhausted, battered, and she knew her life would never again be normal. She would always have bodyguards. She would always live behind reinforced glass and steel doors. But as she looked up at the terrifying man still kneeling at her bedside, crying as he kissed her fingers, the final remnants of her insecurity vanished. She realized she wasn't a prisoner in a gilded cage. She was the absolute center of his universe, the ultimate ruler of the man who ruled the city. What do we name him? Jane whispered, exhausted but radiant. Alberto looked at the mother of his child, the voluptuous, incredibly brave woman who had completely dismantled his cold heart. Leo, Alberto decided softly, honoring the enforcer who had bled to secure the perimeter. Leo Muñoz, the future king of Miami. Jane smiled, pulling Alberto down by the collar of his ruined shirt to capture his lips in a fierce, breathless kiss. Long live the king, she whispered against his mouth. Alberto kissed her back, his large hand gently resting on her soft, abundant waist. And long live the queen.